Yes, you can have a diverse group of reporters in the room from diverse backgrounds, but at the end of the day, we're all still Washington reporters, and we're thinking of things through the lens of Washington, the White House, Capitol Hill, the federal government. Is there, even with this diverse group of people in that briefing room, is there still a risk of bit of groupthink when it comes to what we think are the biggest stories right now, and maybe there's a disconnect between what your audience, your viewers are most interested in right now?
For sure. I think so, because like you said, we're such in this bubble, right? We as reporters suffer the same problems as politicians, I would say, in the DC area. We are in the swamp, we're in the bubble. So I think what I must give credit to both the early Trump administration with Sean Spicer, and now they're having it every Friday, bringing in those local reporters, because they do bring in good questions that maybe you and I would have not thought about because we're not in those communities. And what happens in Washington does affect the whole nation. It doesn't just affect us. And while we do work for national publications that are being read and watched by millions of Americans in every corner of the US, we're not leaving their reality.
The questions that we ask in the briefing room when we do get our chances to do that are things that are interesting to us because perhaps we have a different perspective and a different way of looking at life. You know, when we have a seat in the briefing room, we can ask questions on any number of topics in a day, but for us, we know much more acutely how important this is to us, and that helps kind of elevate those types of questions to the briefing room level that perhaps may not have happened before.
When you have a presidency where the policy is the policy changes are more welcome for your audience, it's more difficult for me to find areas of tension, which is usually the source of a question, to present to the in my questionings for the White House press secretary. Oftentimes, when I'm gathering information from other institutions that are acting on these issues, much like the state legislatures are acting on these measures against transgender youth. So there was definitely a really fundamental change from where McCourt stemmed from, going from a place where the expectation was going to be a policy against my readership to a administration where the expectation is that there'd be supportive actions from the presidency.
But when you're in a position where you are the only Hispanic language television or print who is represented in that small group, now there's only 14 of us rotating at any given time, and it is my responsibility to ask those questions that I may not be covering that story today, but not one of my colleagues in the country is covering an immigration story that will benefit from a White House administration or a government official response. And so it falls on me to go to that White House and ask those specific questions when I know that the press corps will be asking other questions that I may be working on.
I think it's a good, just to point out for people who are watching that don't know how the process works at the White House. You know, right now there are only 14 seats in the briefing room because of COVID restrictions. And at the president's press conference, there were about 40 some, I think total, 50-ish total. So it's not everybody is there. And the president called on 10 people. And I think because of the kind of the Twitter chatter after that, there isn't a coordination among all of us about, you know, and you're going to ask the economic question, and you're going to ask the immigration question. So sometimes that means some topics don't come up because it might have been different if 10 other reporters have been called on and every single question was about Russia or education, something else. So I think it's always, I get this question a lot from people outside of our industry of like, how do you all work together to decide? I'm like, there really isn't a work together to decide. And you do have to serve your particular audience. And sometimes that means it's a follow-up on something else that was already asked. But, you know, when you start looking at a lot of niche media, especially now, you've got to ask the questions that your subscribers are most interested in.
Yeah, I think what we all kind of experienced under the Trump administration was that President Trump and his aides and his supporters just had this concerted strategy of making us the opposition, which I think any journalist would be really uncomfortable put in that position because, like Janet said, we don't want to be the story. I mean, we don't have to talk about it, but I've been like the story recently, and it makes me really uncomfortable because we report the story. We're supposed to be in the backdrop telling, you know, talking to our sources and talking to readers and telling people what's really going on. And that was a particular strategy that the former president took on. And I think most of us tried to do our best to kind of make it clear that our work needs to speak for ourselves, that we're not going to kind of try to engage in this mudslinging back and forth. It still is true that a journalistic brand is still cultivated by good reporting, breaking news, asking good questions, writing stories that are new and interesting and have a different spin on it. And I do believe that ultimately breaks through at the end of the day.
So I do get uncomfortable about that. At the same time, I do see value in this greater visibility, because if you have a greater profile, then you have people are more willing to come to you as information. They see you as somebody who is out there, and some of this more greater visibility can serve as a bridge to your reporting for what you're writing on for, and it can serve as kind of a gateway for sources to bring information as to what they know, what their concerns are. There's any questions they want to have asked in the briefing room. So there is a benefit to that. At the same time, that I definitely prefer to have the topic that I'm writing about be the story as opposed to myself. Social media is also probably one of the most stronger points where you can articulate your ideas now, because things are shared so quickly. People are I think probably more inclined to see a tweet as news than they were many years ago. I think that's the biggest change that I've seen in media so far. It's just kind of a tweet itself being a news event,